The order, when it came, was as cold and hard as the November rain lashing against the study window. It was a soundless room, a place of old leather and older silence, where the Duke of Ravenshaw conducted the business of his life with the grim efficiency of a man settling a debt. "The waste is unacceptable, Finch," he said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. His finger, long and aristocratic, tapped a column of figures in the open ledger. The candlelight caught the sharp line of his jaw, throwing his features into a relief as stark as the landscape outside. He did not look at his steward. He looked only at the numbers, as if they were a personal affront. "The woman is incompetent, an extravagance we cannot afford." Mr. Finch, a man who had weathered 30 years of ducal tempers, stood ramrod straight, his own hands clasped behind his back. He knew this mood. It was the quiet, settled anger that was far more dangerous than any outburst. "Your Grace, she has only been at Harrowmere 2 months. The accounts were in chaos long before her arrival." The Duke looked up then, and the full force of his gaze was enough to make most men take a step back. His eyes were a pale, wintry gray, and they held no light. 2 months is long enough to prove competence, or the lack of it. This house is bleeding money, and she has done nothing to staunch the wound. Her presence is a liability. He closed the ledger with a soft, final thud. The sound was like a gavel falling. "Replace her before the week is out." Finch's throat tightened. "Your Grace, to find a suitable replacement on such short notice, then find an unsuitable one," the Duke cut in, his voice dropping even lower, shearing through the stewardess' protest. "Anyone will be an improvement. I want her gone. See to it." The dismissal was absolute. Finch bowed his head, the picture of quiet acquiescence. "As you command, Your Grace. But men are slow, child, and dukes are slowest of all. And grief, you must understand, makes fools of the cleverest of us." The Duke of Ravenshaw believed he was solving a problem of arithmetic, a simple matter of profit and loss. He could not know, not then, that he had just ordered the heart removed from his own house, and he could not know that his loyal steward, for the first time in his long service, was about to disobey him. Not with words, but with something far more powerful, time, to understand the silence those words were meant to correct. "You have to go back. You have to go back to the day the silence itself was challenged 2 months prior, by the arrival of a woman with nothing left to lose but her own composure. Her name was Harriet Ashton, and she arrived at Harrowmere on a day that threatened a storm but could not quite commit to it. The sky was a bruised purple-gray, and the wind that swept across the moors carried the damp, earthy scent of decay. The estate itself seemed to rise from the land as a monument to sorrow, its granite walls dark with rain, its many windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world from which it had long since withdrawn. Harriet stepped down from the hired carriage, her worn gloves pulled tight, her shoulders squared against the chill. She was the daughter of a solicitor, a man whose good name had been ruined by another's greed, leaving her with an education in contractual law, a keen eye for figures, and a profound understanding of how quickly a respectable life could unravel. Her last position, as companion to a wealthy widow, had ended disastrously. The widow's son had mistaken her quiet presence for an invitation, and when she had rebuffed him, it was she who was dismissed, her character whispered away, without a reference. Useless. It was the word her own aunt had used. A woman with a mind for ledgers, and no fortune for a dowry. Useless. Harrowmere was her last chance. A temporary post as housekeeper, overseeing a ducal household that had, according to the solicitor in London, chewed through 4 such women in the last year. "The Duke is particular," the man had warned, his tone suggesting a much harsher word, "and the ward is difficult." Harriet looked up at the great oak door, at the carved stone raven above it, its wings spread as if in permanent flight from the house itself. She was not afraid of particular men or difficult children, She was afraid of starvation. She was afraid of the creeping cold of charity. She took a steadying breath and walked up the steps. From a tall window on the first floor, Henry, the Duke of Ravenshaw, watched her approach. He was not a man given to observation of his staff. He preferred them to be invisible, a series of silent, efficient functions that kept the machinery of his life running. But Finch had been insistent. "She is not like the others, Your Grace. There is a steadiness to her." Henry saw nothing of the sort. He saw a woman of middling height, dressed in a plain gray traveling cloak, her face obscured by a modest bonnet. He saw worn luggage and a posture that was too rigid, as if held together by sheer will. He noticed the way she paused at the bottom of the steps, her head tilted up to take in the cold facade of the house, and for a moment he thought she might turn and flee, as the last one had, but she did not. She lifted her chin, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and ascended the steps with a purpose that seemed at odds with her fragile appearance. He watched until the great door swallowed her, and then he turned away from the window, the brief flicker of interest already extinguished. His world had been reduced to this: a cold house, a silent child, and the crushing weight of a duty he had never asked for. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. The house received Harriet with a chilly indifference. The staff, a skeleton crew of long-serving locals, regarded her with the weary suspicion of people accustomed to fleeting authority. The butler, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of mild disapproval, showed her to a small, cold room at the back of the house. The air smelled of damp stone and beeswax. "His Grace rarely leaves his study," the butler informed her. "And the young mistress, Miss Cecily, she keeps to her rooms. Your duties will primarily concern the household accounts and the staff. We have our own way of doing things." The unspoken message was clear. Do not disturb the quiet misery of this place. But Harriet had not come to be quiet. She had come to work. Her first week was a study in observation. She walked the cold, echoing corridors, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble floors. She found rooms shrouded in dust sheets, their furniture like pale ghosts in the gloom. She found a library where priceless books were beginning to mildew, and a morning room where the sun was perpetually barred by heavy velvet curtains. The house was not just neglected, it was grieving. It was a place that had stopped breathing. And at the heart of the stillness was the child, Cecily. She was 10 years old, a wisp of a girl with her uncle's pale gray eyes and a mouth that seemed to have forgotten how to smile. She was the Duca's ward, the only child of his younger brother, who, along with his wife, had been killed in a carriage accident on the estate's treacherous roads a year ago. Since that day, the girl had barely spoken. Harriet saw her only in fleeting glimpses, a small figure darting down a hallway, a pale face in an upper window. The nursery maid reported that Miss Cecily would not attend lessons, would not eat with the staff, and spent her days in her room, clutching a small, rosewood box that she refused to let out of her sight. Harriet did not force an introduction. A poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford. Instead, she began her work in the one place she knew she could make a difference: the ledgers. The steward, Mr. Finch, gave them to her with a sigh of relief. They were a disaster. Decades of genteel mismanagement were recorded in the spidery script of his predecessor. Tradesmen were overcharging, supplies were being ordered in duplicate, and there was no clear accounting of the estate's outgoing funds. She worked late into the night in the small office allotted to her, a single candle pushing back the encroaching darkness. The scratch of her pen was often the only sound in the vast, sleeping house. It was on the fourth night that she first felt she was being watched. She looked up from her figures and saw him standing in the doorway. The Duke of Ravenshaw was taller than she had expected, and the stillness she had observed from the window was even more pronounced up close. He did not move, did not speak, simply stood there, a formidable silhouette, against the deeper shadows of the hall. He had been told she was a solicitor's daughter. He had expected someone bookish and timid. The woman before him was neither. Her face, illuminated by the candlelight, was composed and serious, her eyes clear and direct as they met his. There was an intelligence in them that was not easily cowed. "You are working late, Miss Ashton," he said. It was not a question. "The accounts require it, Your Grace," she replied, her voice even. He took a step into the room. He noticed the ink smudge on her finger and the neat, precise columns of her handwriting. He noticed that she had not flinched or flustered at his sudden appearance. "Finch tells me you have some skill with numbers." "My father believed a woman should be able to balance her own accounts," she said. It was an unfashionable opinion, self-sufficient. The word for a horse that does not need to be fed. An awkward silence stretched between them. He was a man accustomed to commanding, not conversing. He felt an unfamiliar urge to explain the state of the house, the grief that held it in its thrall, but the words would not come. His reputation for coldness was a fortress he had built himself, and he had long since forgotten how to lower the gate. "See that you do not waste candles," he said finally, the words sounding harsher than he intended. He turned and was gone, melting back into the shadows. Harriet watched him go, her hands perfectly still on the desk. She had felt the chill of his presence long after he departed. It was not cruelty she sensed in him, but a profound aching loneliness. He was the ghost haunting his own home. The house began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Harrieta's changes were practical, not decorative. She did not challenge the dust sheets or the closed-off rooms. Instead, she started in the kitchens. She discovered the cook was selling surplus supplies to the village innkeeper. She did not accuse. She simply adjusted the ordering, her penstroke eliminating the opportunity for theft. The cook, a bluff, wary woman named Mrs. Gable, watched her with grudging respect. She found the laundry maids were using harsh lye soap that was ruining the fine linens. She sourced a gentler soap from a nearby town, explaining that it would make the linen last longer. It was a matter of economy, she said, not comfort. The staff understood economy, but her greatest challenge was Cecily. The girl treated Harrieta's presence as an invasion. One afternoon, Harriet entered the library to find a pot of ink upended across a priceless Persian rug. Cecily stood nearby, her small face a mask of defiance, the rosewood box clutched in her hands. The nursery maid was wringing her hands ready to scold. Harriet held up a hand to stop her. She knelt, examining the stain. "Ink is expensive," she said, her voice calm, speaking to the girl as if they were discussing the weather. "If you wish to waste it, let us at least make patterns on paper, not the floor. The floor has no appreciation for art." She rose, fetched a basin of water and salt, and began to patiently blot at the stain. She did not look at Cecily again. She did not demand an apology. The crime was the waste, not the rebellion. From the corner of her eye, she saw the girl's defiant posture soften, replaced by a flicker of confusion. It was the first crack in the wall of silence. Henry heard about the incident from Finch. He had expected a request for the girl to be punished. Instead, the steward reported, "Miss Ashton simply cleaned it up. She told the maids it was an accident." He found himself thinking about that. He had tried everything with Cecily. Tutors, doctors, stern lectures, even pleading. Nothing had pierced the shell of her grief. He had concluded she was a stubborn, difficult child, a reminder of a loss he could not bear to face directly. He had never considered that her rebellion was not an act of will, but of pain. A few days later, a crisis erupted. A storm, the one that had been threatening for weeks, finally broke with a terrifying violence. Rain hammered the roof, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. In the middle of the night, a crack of lightning struck one of the ancient oaks near the house, sending it crashing down onto the roof of the west wing, directly above the kitchens. Panic ensued. Servants ran through the halls with candles, their faces pale with fear. Water began to pour through a gaping hole in the ceiling. In the midst of the chaos, Harriet appeared. She was dressed, her hair neatly pinned, her voice the calmest in the house. "Mrs. Gable, get your staff and move all the dry goods from the pantry, Thomas. You and the stable hands will fetch every bucket you can find. Mr. Finch, we must assess the structural damage as soon as it is light." She issued orders with a quiet authority that no one thought to question. Henry, drawn by the commotion, found her directing the placement of buckets, her skirts already damp, her face smudged with soot. She was a point of stillness in the swirling storm of panic. He watched as she took a blanket from a frightened young maid and wrapped it around the girl's shoulders, murmuring something he could hear. It was a small gesture, but it spoke of a kindness he had not seen in this house for a very long time. He had inherited a title and a duty, but he had never learned how to manage a home. He managed holdings, investments, tenants. He did not know how to manage fear or grief or the simple human mechanics of a household in crisis. He watched her, and for the first time, he felt a stirring of something other than grim responsibility. It was a grudging, unfamiliar respect. The next morning, as the storm receded, leaving a washed, clean world in its wake, he found her in the morning room. Against all precedent, she had ordered the heavy curtains drawn back. Watery sunlight streamed in, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. It fell across the portrait of his late brother and his wife, which hung above the mantelpiece. He stopped in the doorway. "No one has opened these curtains in a year." Harriet turned from where she was examining the damp patch spreading on the wall. "A house needs light to breathe, Your Grace, especially after a storm. This room was my brother's favorite," he said, his voice tight. "We have kept it as he liked it. He is gone, Your Grace," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "But the house remains. The people in it remain. If you wish for it to stay a tomb, you must say so plainly, 'I will not work in a tomb.'" It was a direct challenge. Any other servant would have been dismissed on the spot for such impertinence. He looked at her, standing there in the forbidden sunlight, her expression serious, her gaze unwavering. He had surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, who walked on eggshells around his grief. This woman, this penniless solicitor's daughter, was telling him the truth. He looked at the portrait of his brother, at the laughing, vibrant face he missed, with an ache that had never subsided, and he looked at the sunlight touching the frame, making the colors seem alive again. "Leave them open," he said, and walked away. It was the first surrender. It would not be the last. The true thaw began, not with the Duke, but with the child. Harriet continued to leave small offerings for Cecily, a book of pressed wildflowers on a hall table, a dish of honey cakes left outside her door. She never demanded a response. Then came the arrival of Alistair Vane. He was Cecilia's maternal uncle, a man with a politician's charm and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He arrived unannounced, his carriage, far grander than his modest fortune should have allowed, bearing gifts and a great show of affection for his niece. "My dearest Cecily," he cooed, sweeping the girl into an embrace. "Trapped in this gloomy mausoleum with your solemn uncle, I have come to rescue you." Cecily, starved for warmth, clung to him. Henry watched from a distance, his expression unreadable, a muscle tightening in his jaw. He disliked Vane, a man whose ambition was as plain as his waistcoat, but he was family. Harriet observed him with a cool, dispassionate eye. She saw the way Vanya's gaze swept over the room, assessing its value. She saw how his questions to the staff were not about Cecilia's well-being, but about the estate's management, its income, its difficulties. He was a man taking inventory. He made a great show of trying to befriend the silent child. "What is this, my dear?" he asked one afternoon, tapping the rosewood box she carried everywhere. "A box of secrets?" Cecily clutched it tighter. "It was Mamma's." "Then we must keep it safe." "Must not." "We," he said, his voice like warm honey. "Let your uncle look after it for you. Your mother would have wanted me to." He reached for it. For the first time, Cecily spoke in a full, clear sentence, her voice ringing with panic. "No, Ida's mine." She backed away, her eyes wide with fear. Vani's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before he recovered his charm. "Of course, my dear, of course." Later that day, in a fit of rage and confusion, Cecily sought out Harriet. She found her in the linen closet, calmly counting sheets. The girl stood in the doorway, her small body trembling. She held out the key to the rosewood box. "You open it," she demanded, her voice choked with tears. "He wants it. You take it." She threw the key at Harrietta's feet. It landed with a small metallic clink. Harriet bent and picked it up. She did not speak, she simply held it in her palm, then walked with Cecily back to her room. She sat on the floor beside the girl and held out her hand for the box. Cecily hesitated, then relinquished it. With steady fingers, Harriet inserted the key and turned the lock. The lid opened with a faint sigh. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon, a mother-of-pearl button, and a small, simple watercolor drawing of a robin. Harriet did not touch the letters. She picked up the drawing. "Your mother was a fine artist," she said softly. "My father drew that," Cecily whispered, her voice barely audible. "He said it was the first bird of spring. He gave it to Mama." "It is beautiful," Harriet said, tracing the delicate lines with her finger. "He must have loved her very much to capture something so full of life." They sat in silence for a long time, the two of them, looking at the small painting. For the first time since the accident, Cecily was not just clutching her grief, she was sharing it. When Harriet finally made to leave, the girl's small hand shot out and grasped her sleeve. "Do not tell him," she whispered. "Don't tell Uncle Alistair." "I won't," Harriet promised. "It is your secret, to keep." From that day on, the wall between them crumbled. Cecily began to speak to her, first in whispers, then in sentences. She started attending lessons. She even one afternoon allowed Harriet to read to her from one of the books in the mildewed library. The sound of a voice reading a story was so foreign in that house that a passing maid stopped in the hall to listen, a slow smile spreading across her face. Henry, too, found his own walls being breached. He began to seek Harriet out, using the excuse of the household accounts. Their late-night sessions in her small office became a strange sort of ritual. She would show him the figures, explaining her plans for economy, her voice calm and logical. He found himself listening not just to her words, but to the quiet intelligence behind them. He learned she had a dry, understated wit that surfaced only when she was focused on a problem. He started asking her questions that had nothing to do with ledgers. He asked about her father, about the books she was reading. He learned that her composure was not a lack of feeling, but a shield forged in a life of disappointments. He noticed things. He noticed the way her brow furrowed when she was concentrating, the way she would unconsciously straighten a stack of papers, bringing order to everything she touched. He noticed her kindness to the staff, her patience with his niece, her unyielding honesty with him. Men do not always care to be seen, but he was beginning to realize how much he cared to see her. This fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a legal notice. Alistair Vane had filed a formal petition with the courts. He was suing for guardianship of Cecily and for control of her substantial inheritance. The grounds were neglect. He claimed the Duke of Ravenshaw was an unfit guardian, a recluse lost in his own grief, and that the estate was being grossly mismanaged, endangering the child's future. And as proof of the household's disarray, he cited the character of the new housekeeper, Miss Harriet Ashton. The petition contained a cruel, twisted version of the incident that had cost Harriet her last position. It painted her as a woman of loose morals, an adventuress who had been dismissed for improper conduct. It suggested she was entirely unfit to be in the same house as a vulnerable young girl. The lie was a poisoned dart, aimed with precision. It struck Henry not just in his duty as a guardian, but in the fragile, budding trust he had begun to feel. He read the words. and a cold fury settled over him. He had been made a fool of. This woman, with her quiet competence and her steady gaze, was just another in a long line of people who wanted something from him. The chaos in the ledgers, the waste she was supposedly fixing at it, was all part of the same incompetence Vane described. He had been wrong about her. He summoned Finch to his study. The November rain had returned, and the room was dark, filled with the same oppressive silence that had ruled the house for a year. He stood by the window, the legal papers clenched in his fist, and that is when he spoke the words. The cold, hard words of a man betrayed, a man retreating back into the safety of his fortress. Replace her. Before the week is out. Finch did not argue. He had seen the Duca's face. He knew that in that moment, reason would find no purchase, so he bowed, and he left, and he began the charade of searching for a replacement he had no intention of finding. For 3 days, a strange tension held Harrowmere in its grip. Harriet, unaware of the sentence passed upon her, continued her duties. But she felt the change. The Duke was once again a ghost, a presence felt but never seen. When their paths did cross, he looked through her, his eyes as cold and distant as they had been on her first day. The brief warmth that had begun to kindle between them was gone, replaced by an icy wall. She felt the familiar ache of disappointment settle in her chest. She had allowed herself to hope, and hope, she knew, was a fool's game. Henry, for his part, was miserable. He had expected to feel a sense of righteous order restored. Instead, he felt only a hollow, echoing emptiness. The house, which had been slowly coming back to life, seemed to hold its breath. Cecily, sensing the shift, grew quiet and withdrawn again, the rosewood box once more her constant companion. He took his meals alone in his study, the silence pressing in on him. He kept listening for the soft tread of Harrieta's shoes in the hall, for the low murmur of her voice reading to Cecily, for the scratch of her pen in the office next door. But there was only silence. On the 4th night, unable to sleep, he went to the library in search of a book. The room was dark, but a thin sliver of light shone from beneath the door of Harrieta's office. He frowned. Finch was supposed to have dismissed her by now. He pushed the door open without knocking. The scene before him stopped him cold. Harriet was asleep in her chair, her head resting on her folded arms on the desk. A single candle burned low, its flame guttering. And spread all around her were the trust documents for Cecilia's inheritance. Beside them were sheets of paper covered in her neat, precise script, lines and arrows connecting clauses, numbers and dates circled in red ink. He stepped closer, his anger forgotten, replaced by a sudden, sharp curiosity. He picked up one of the sheets. It was a flowchart, tracing the movement of funds from Cecilia's trust. What he saw made his blood run cold. The thing that he and his London solicitors had missed. A cleverly worded clause, buried deep in the legal jargon, gave the secondary trustee Alistair Vania the power to invest funds in ventures of his own choosing with minimal oversight. And invest he had. Harriet had cross-referenced the dates of the withdrawals with public records of Vania's own business dealings. Every one of his investments on Cecilia's behalf corresponded to the launch of one of his own failed companies. He was not just mismanaging the trust, he was systematically embezzling it, using the girl's inheritance to fund his own lavish lifestyle while making it look like the fault of the estate's administration. The waste Henry had seen in the ledgers was not incompetence. It was theft. He looked down at Harriet, asleep at her post, her face softened in the candlelight. She had worked for nights on end, alone, to uncover this. Not for praise, not for reward, but because it was her nature to bring order out of chaos, to find the truth in a column of figures. He had called her incompetent. He had called her a liability. He had ordered her thrown out of his house. And she, in return, had saved his family. A wave of shame so profound, it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. He had been so trapped in his own pride, his own fear of being deceived, that he had been blind to the one person who had been honest with him from the very beginning. He reached out, his hand hovering over her shoulder, wanting to wake her, to apologize, to explain. But he stopped. What could he say? Words were inadequate. He gently took the blanket from the back of her chair and draped it over her, his touch so light she did not stir. Then he stood there for a long time watching her sleep, the guardian of his house, while the truth rearranged itself in his heart. The day of the guardianship hearing was bright and cold. The small magistrate's court was packed with local gentry, all eager for a glimpse into the affairs of the reclusive Duke of Ravenshaw. Alistair Vane was in his element, dressed in a fine suit, his expression one of sober concern. He presented his case with practiced ease, painting a damning picture of a great house in decline, a grieving uncle unable to cope, and a vulnerable child left in the care of a woman of questionable character. He presented the doctored ledgers as proof of mismanagement. When it was Henriot's turn to speak, he did not address Phineas' accusations against him. He simply said, "I would like to call Miss Harriet Ashton to speak on the matter of the trust accounts." A murmur went through the crowd. Harriet walked to the front of the room, her face pale but composed. She carried a single folder of papers. Vane watched her with a condescending smirk. What could this dismissed housekeeper possibly have to say? Harriet did not look at him. She looked at the magistrate. And in a clear, calm voice, she began to speak. She did not use emotional language. She used facts. She laid out the paper trail, clause by clause, date by date, figure by figure. She explained the complex legal language in simple terms that everyone in the room could understand. She exposed the shell companies, the false reports, the systematic theft. The room grew utterly silent as she spoke. The only sound, her steady voice and the rustle of the papers she presented as evidence. Vinaya's face went from smug to confused to ashen. The architecture of his lies was being dismantled, brick by brick, by a solicitor's daughter with a head for numbers. When she finished, the silence was deafening. The magistrate stared at the evidence, his face grim. He turned to Vane. "Do you have a response to these grave allegations, Mr. Vane?" Vane stammered, his charm deserting him entirely. It's a misunderstanding. The woman is. She is trying to discredit me," but no one was listening to him anymore. They were all looking at Harriet, at this quiet, unassuming woman who had just exposed a duke's trust for the fraud it was. The magistrate, however, had one final question. He turned to the child who sat quietly beside a stern-faced nursery maid. "Miss Cecily," he said, his voice gentle, "this is all very complicated for a young lady, but I must ask you, if you could choose, who would you want to look after you?" Every eye in the room turned to the small girl. Vane leaned forward, a desperate, fleeting smile on his face. "Tell them, my dear. Tell them you want to come with your Uncle Alistair, who loves you." Cecily looked at her uncle, her expression unreadable. She looked at the Duke, who watched her with a quiet, painful intensity. And then her gaze found Harriet, who stood alone, having presented her truth, expecting nothing. Slowly, deliberately, Cecily slid off her chair. She walked across the wooden floor, her small shoes clicking with each step. She walked past her uncle, past the Duke, and did not stop until she was standing directly in front of Harriet. She reached out and took her hand. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper. It was clear and strong, and it rang through the silent courtroom. "I want to stay with Harriet," she said. She looked at the magistrate. "She didn't try to take my mother's box. She just helped me open it." It was the final, devastating blow. A child's simple truth, cutting through all the adult complexities of law and finance. The case was over. Alistair Vania's reputation was ruined not by a duke's power, but by a woman's diligence and a child's trust. That night, Harrowmere was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a storm that had passed, of a fever that had broken. Henry found Harriet in the library. She was not working. She was standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit gardens, her hands clasped behind her back. She looked tired, but the rigid control she usually held in her posture was gone. He stood in the doorway for a moment, the words he had rehearsed feeling clumsy and inadequate. Finally, he spoke. "Harriet?" She turned. He had never used her Christian name before. "I have been a fool," he said, the admission costing his pride more than any sum of money. A blind, arrogant fool. He walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. He told her everything. He told her about Vania's accusations, about his own wounded pride, about the cold fury that had led him to his study that day. "I told Finch to replace you," he confessed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "I told him to have you gone before the week was out." She showed no surprise. Her expression remained serene. "I see," she said quietly. "No," he said, shaking his head. "You don't." Finch was wise enough to disobey a duca's command. "He told me he searched, but that he could not find anyone better. He was right. There is no one better." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "You saved this family, Harriet. You saved Cecily. You saved me from my own folly." She looked at him, her gaze searching his. "Do not say these things out of gratitude. Your Grace, I have had enough of being useful. I have had enough of being useful." The words landed with the quiet force of a revelation. He had seen her as a solution, an employee, an instrument of order. He had never considered what she herself might need or want. "It is not gratitude," he said, and the truth of it resonated deep in his chest. "It is necessity. When I found you asleep at the desk, when I realized what you had done, I understood something. The silence in this house. I thought it was grief, but it wasn't. It was loneliness. And you brought light back into the rooms. You gave Cecily back her voice. You made this house a home again." He reached out and with a hesitation that spoke volumes, he gently touched her arm. "This was meant to be a position of employment. It is no longer. If you will have it." He could not say the word love. It was a foreign language he had not spoken in years, but he was asking her to stay. Not as his housekeeper, as his equal. Tears welled in her eyes, the first he had ever seen. She did not let them fall. She simply nodded. A small, almost imperceptible movement that changed everything. 6 months later, the morning room at Harrowmere was filled with the scent of roses and the sound of laughter. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, falling on the portrait of a smiling couple, beneath which a small vase of fresh flowers always sat. Cecily, no longer a silent wraith, was chasing a puppy across the newly restored rugs, her shrieks of delight echoing through the halls. The house was alive, breathing again. Harriet, now the Duchess of Ravenshaw, stood by the French doors, watching the girl play. A hand came to rest on her shoulder, and she leaned back into her husband's embrace. "Finch tendered his resignation this morning," Henry said, his voice a low murmur against her ear. Harriet turned in surprise. "Mr. Finch?" Why, a rare smile touched Henria's lips. He said his work was done. He had finally found a permanent and satisfactory housekeeper for Harrowmere. He looked at her, his wintry gray eyes now filled with a warmth that was reserved only for her. "I told him he was a fool. You were never satisfactory. You were essential." He drew her closer, his gaze drifting to Cecily. "He could search for 100 years," he said softly. "The order was to replace a housekeeper, but he could never replace the woman who stayed." And in the quiet peace of the morning, Harriet knew she was finally home. She had come to the cold, silent house, seeking a position, and had found a family. She had been seen, not for her usefulness, but for her worth. And that, she had learned, was a foundation upon which a life and a love could be built. She had become the woman who stayed. What do you think is the true turning point for the Duke? Is it when he sees her work, or when the child chooses her? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of love and redemption. Let us know where you're watching from in the world. We love to see how far our stories travel. We'll be back soon with another story. Just for you.